But let's move on and talk about X-Men Days of Future Past, which came out 3 years later in 2014. So this was obviously the follow-up to X-Men First Class, which they quickly put into development because they said, yes, let's go ahead and make more of these, and let's figure out a way to merge these two storylines, these two different eras of X-Men. So in the comics, Days of Future Past, it's a storyline where we see a dystopian future. Mutants are essentially incarcerated in internment camps, and we see an older Kitty Pryde transfer her mind into her younger self, and she goes to the present day Kitty Pryde, basically to bring the X-Men together to prevent this fatal moment in history that essentially triggers this anti-mutant hysteria. So obviously tapping into a lot of the fears and apprehensions that humanity would have towards mutants, and this basically became the basis for the film. And this is one of the most famous X-Men stories in all of the comics. It's a really huge story, really significant event, with a lot of consequences. And Simon Kinberg, he said that the main focus of this film was going to be the future of the X-Men film series. So not only taking this very well-known and pretty beloved story, but also thinking about how can we set up more of these movies? How can we create a new series of films? And in preparation for the movie, Simon Kinberg, who was ultimately the screenwriter, he studied films about time travel, including Back to the Future, The Terminator, and Terminator 2 Judgment Day, all great films. And Bryan Singer, the director, originated a philosophy and a set of rules for time travel in the film, so the story would try to be as plausible as possible, obviously considering that time travel is, a fantastical concept, and so you sort of have to create your own rules. Do you recall how you felt about this announcement when you heard it, with Days of Future Past being the next story? Just, I think, knowing at that point, because you had already, had familiarity with X-Men as a property in those stories, like, what did you think about that they were going to tackle something that was pretty significant and quite possibly, I think, up until this point, out of all the movies that we saw, it might have been their biggest story that they tried to tackle in live action up until this point?
Absolutely. And I think, at the time, I remember being both excited and scared because it was such an important story. And one, again, the X-Men fans are like, y'all better get this right. You know what I'm saying? Like, that's one, it's like, you point at the screen like, hey, that is that supposed to be like that? What y'all doing? What's happening here? And so I remember being excited that they did decide to tackle it, though, because it is such a prominent and important storyline to the history of X-Men. And so, yeah, man, going in, I think I just wanted them to do the best job possible, but I was scared because I didn't know, there was so much, there was so much there, I think, for them to mess up and for them to tackle. But coming off of First Class, I was like, okay, let's see what we can do then. What are we talking about? Let's do it. And so, yeah, I was both excited and afraid for what to happen. That's what I remember.
Yeah, I think when we look at the most recent example of a huge storyline that they tried to adapt before, the Dark Phoenix saga, and we saw how that went, it was obviously, I think, cause for apprehension. Like, okay, well, can they handle something that is going to involve a lot of characters, like a lot more characters than we've even seen? That was sort of the thought, like, all right, it makes sense. I do want to see this ultimately because this is really important to the history of the X-Men, but at the same time, is this the right time for that? Are we in a good enough spot for this? And again, just comparing to what we were seeing on the other side of things with the MCU, who were now pretty much fully cooking at this point. I mean, 2013, coming off of Avengers, Iron Man 3 comes out, makes $1.2 billion. It's phenomenal. A phenomenal success, not a phenomenal movie, but a phenomenal success. Winter Soldier is right around the corner. Like, things are starting to really heat up for them, and you're starting to see, again, this long form serialized storytelling that they're really like taking their time with. And so I was excited for Days of Future Past, no doubt about it. But I think at the same time I was thinking like, okay, that's a lot to do for a movie. You can do it. There's a way to do it, but also, how are we gonna make this all make sense, just considering the legacy, I think, of what the films have become up until that point. But they certainly had an answer, because their plan was to basically bring together these two different casts, these two different eras of X-Men. But they did make some changes to the story. As I talked about in just like the opening description of Days of Future Past, Kitty Pryde is really the central figurehead that goes back in time and does the time travel. They instead decided to make it into Wolverine. And according to Simon Kinberg, as they were writing the script, he thought it would be more sensible for it to be Wolverine to time travel between the time periods, because he had an ageless look, and also his ability to heal rapidly made sense for their particular world. And he further stated by making Wolverine the time traveler that, quote, "We made the decision for lots of reasons. He's the protagonist of the franchise and probably the most beloved character to a mass audience," end quote. Which I think I get. I definitely think I get that.
Mhm.
Nobody was more popular in this franchise than Hugh Jackman. He was a superstar,
Right.
movie star, huge. But it also does inherently change the story quite a bit when you change it in this way and you take the focus off of Kitty Pryde. I mean, how did you feel about it then, and how do you feel about it now? I mean, we've had time to even sit with this decision. Like, yes,
Mhm.
Wolverine, I think in the context of this film series, makes total sense. But at the same time, could there have been a chance to maybe present the spotlight to somebody else who had not necessarily gotten the chance to be at the forefront of a movie? Could that maybe have created more of a sustainable plan for longevity if you want to really build up your new roster of characters and take them into the next generation?
Yeah, it's such an interesting thing to me because back then I was like, duh, of course it's Wolverine. Who else is going to be? But now looking back at it, man, even when I was watching, I was like, Wolverine technically is not doing the most here. You know what I mean? And in fact, he only gives us weird continuity errors with like William Stryker and stuff. I was like, I don't know what's going on here. But when I was watching, I was like, first of all, Kitty could have been cool. Second of all, somebody else who's able to go back in time is like probably a Quicksilver that can move really fast. You know what I mean? Or like, I just kept having ideas of like, did this really have to be Wolverine? I don't know. I think I understand from a business standpoint, right? Everybody wants to see Hugh Jackman. Everybody wants to see him interact with these characters. It's very accurate that is him in Days of Future Past. But what does it look like if Kitty does get that opportunity? Because she is such an important. We still have yet really to see how important Kitty is supposed to be in these movies. I mean, this is like a very important character, and so I would have loved to see if it was Kitty that was able to make that. But yeah, I was actually thinking about that. I was doing this last rewatch of like, does this have to be Wolverine? I'm not sure. But yeah, I guess we'll never know.
Yeah, and I think it's a double-edged sword. Love Hugh Jackman. He's always incredible. Obviously, we sang his praises last week when we talked about his trilogy of movies. But with that being said, we had already seen so much of him. I mean, he was
Hmm.
always there. He was always sort of omnipresent throughout this entire franchise. They went so far as to make sure that they got a cameo of him in First Class, which is a great cameo, by the way. It's fantastic and it makes all
Hmm.
the sense in the world. But then we like double down and triple down, and now again he's the lead of this series once again, after he already pretty much was the lead of 3 movies within the X-Men series. Now he's also in his own sort of trilogy of films. 2 of them had come out at this point, so we had seen quite a lot of Hugh Jackman. But if it ain't broke, don't fix it. I mean, that's kind of what
Hmm.
it all comes down to. If you have the same criticism for Hugh Jackman, I think you kind of have to have the same criticism for Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man in the MCU, because there were many stories that they had to sort of contort and change in order to fit his narrative that might have not necessarily reflected that in the comics, and it's
Yeah.
it's somewhat different, because he is dealing with more of an ensemble, I think, throughout the course of all of those movies, whereas Hugh Jackman is oftentimes going on a lot of solo adventures when he's in these films, even in Days of Future Past. Like, a lot of what he has to do is in isolation. Like, he's the only one that can go back in time. He has to deal with young Eric and young Charles, but it's one of those things where it's like, the guy is the MVP for a reason. He is, sort of who they built the franchise around and centered
Yeah.
him on. So they weren't really going to change that. But again, as you said, I do look at it sometimes and just wonder, like, what could that have been if they decided to just go in somewhat of a different direction? Also, some things got drastically cut and altered in this movie, because we got to think this was 2014. So as I continue to sort of reiterate, the MCU is on fire now. Like, they are
Yep.
fully moving and shaking. Not only that, we also have on the other side of things Sony producing Spider-Man films with Andrew Garfield. DC is trying to launch their own universe. So the whole superhero landscape is really in full motion now. Earlier in those episodes, we were talking about a very, very sparse superhero landscape, like only a few
Hmm.
options every so often. The movie might be great or it might not be. Now we have all the options in the world. And earlier versions of this film script, of Days of Future Past script, had a young Juggernaut helping Xavier, Beast, and Wolverine essentially break Magneto out of the Pentagon. Juggernaut would have been thrown out of the plane at 20,000 feet, crashing into the Pentagon to land in Magneto's cell. I kind of want to see that now. Now that
I
I think
do
about it, that
too.
that
I
sounds
do
kind of
too.
cool. But ultimately, Juggernaut was written out of the script and replaced with Quicksilver when the film's producers learned that another version of the character would appear, in Marvel Studios' Avengers Age of Ultron. So I guess as a petty slight, they decided to say, wait a second, that's an X-Men and y'all are going to include him? Oh, no, we can't have that. We're going to make our own
Mhm.
version of Quicksilver,
Mhm.
because at this time, Marvel Studios technically shared the film rights to both Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch with 20th Century Fox, but they had to avoid conflict with Fox's X-Men films. And Joss Whedon, the director of Avengers Age of Ultron, he introduced those characters into the MCU on his own terms for the first time, and allowed him to connect their origin stories to the rest of the universe so that they could completely avoid the concept of mutants entirely, because they couldn't say that word at that particular point. How crazy is this in hindsight? I mean, I knew this at the time. I remember reading all about this, but
Mhm.
now knowing what we know and just see how things shape and play out over the course of, the past 10 years or so. I mean, this is crazy that we're sort of thinking about things in this way, where we're getting characters who are getting shared, they're popping up and being portrayed by multiple actors. I mean, the ironic part of it is this is kind of the impetus for the multiverse to begin with, right? Like
Yeah.
this is the start of it all, really, the behind the scenes
Mhm.
Hollywood stuff that also plays out in front of us on screen. So what are your thoughts on just like the whole development of Quicksilver and how he was ultimately brought into this movie?
Bro, I have to say, when I first seen Age of Ultron, I was like, huh? Because at the end of or in the movie, even before that, the post credit scene of what movie was that? When you see them bouncing off the wall, Quicksilver bouncing off the
Oh,
wall.
that was
They go like,
Winter Soldier. Yeah.
Winter Soldier, the
Yeah.
Winter Soldier post credit scene. I was like, experiments? This isn't correct. I remember being so appalled of like, wait a second. I know we ain't talking about Wanda and Pietro. You know what I'm saying? I remember being like so angry, like, what is happening here? Why are we doing this? But again, all the rights and stuff make sense. I understand wanting to use Quicksilver. I really do get it. But man, it was really weird for me at the time. Just being such a big just X-Men fan and knowing how Pietro and Wanda were supposed to work in the context of X-Men. I was like, whoa, what is going on here? And so man, it's weird. You said it. It's just weird, man. And it's crazy to see how all of this kind of unfolded over the years. Unfortunately, eventually we get Ralph Boner and all the other stuff come out of this, and it's like I can't do anything but roll my eyes. But I think I'm just so happy that Quicksilver they went with the Quicksilver scene instead, because it's one of my favorite parts of the movie is that these goddamn Quicksilver scenes. And so I really like that they didn't kind of go with the Juggernaut stuff, because that sounds, I think, a little too ridiculous for what they were going for in this film in Days of Future Past. I mean, there is something about the way action works and also the time that you're trying to tell the story. And Juggernaut just sounds like too much. Juggernaut just sounds like too much. But I really like that they decided to go with none other than Magneto's son. You know what I'm saying? It's like, yeah, let's do that. So I think it's a good idea that they went that direction. But man, I will never forget being mad at the whole what is going on with Quicksilver thing. Because when I heard that they were experiments and not mutants, it just really threw me for a loop.
Yeah, I think this is petty studio play, who are trying to figure out all the ways possible that they can sort of color outside the lines, and do what they can to try to get away with certain things, even though, legally there's obviously so many ramifications as to what that might mean. And of course, Marvel Studios and Disney, they want to have access to all their characters. I mean, Marvel is owned by Disney, and Marvel should ultimately have access to their characters, but we know just throughout history that wasn't meant to be, because they ultimately licensed a lot of these things out. But we hadn't really seen anything like this before, because there wasn't really a chance or an opportunity to do this. Like, superhero movies hadn't been as huge as they ultimately became by this particular point, to see like competing studios possibly use some of the same characters with completely different like that wasn't even a thought before this. at,
Mm-hmm.
at best you would see the same actor be in multiple universes, like somebody might be in a DC movie and a Marvel movie, but to
Oh
see a
yeah. Mm-hmm.
character appear in two different films from two different studios, played by two different actors within a calendar year, it's kind of crazy to think about. But Quicksilver wasn't the only new character in this movie. We, of course, got all of the returning cast from X-Men First Class for the most part, and the legacy cast. We'll get to them in a second. But there were some new mutants that were introduced in this movie that had not been in previous X-Men films. We got Omar Sy coming in here as Bishop. Adon
Mm-hmm.
Canto was cast as Sunspot. Boo Boo Stewart was Warpath, and Fan Bingbing played Blink. And this is all, again, in
Yeah.
addition to Quicksilver. So these were four new mutants who were sort of on the futuristic side of the story. They were with our legacy characters. They were with Storm and the older Charles and the older Eric and the older Wolverine by this point. but we hadn't seen them prior to this at all. So all of the developments and their connection and how they eventually became a part of this resistance in the future, all of this happened off screen, but it did, again, I think, allow for a new opportunity for some new mutants to come in and have a chance to shine. They're not in the movie a ton. They don't always get the most to do, but again, this is a larger ensemble cast where there's so many things happening. But what do you want to say about just sort of their inclusion here? The fact that, we didn't really know them prior to this in terms of the live action movies, but then they were on the side of our legacy characters as opposed to, maybe the younger characters from the previous generation.
Man, I was just happy to see him. I was like, hell yeah. Cause especially that opening scene is so crazy. And even throughout the movie, just the whole Chinese temple post-apocalyptic sentinel thing is such a crazy world. I think I was excited to see particularly those characters because they provided, particularly Bishop and Blink, provided like so much color to the movie. Blink with her like purple, pink, what is it called? Wormholes? I don't know what you want to call them.
Yeah, portals, I guess. Yeah,
portals. Yeah, there we go, portals. And then Bishop, with his, of course, red energy. I was just like, I love the color going on, especially you kind of talked about it. The costumes were still kind of like that black base, and then let's add like a touch of something in there. I was glad to see these characters too, because again, I think every time you add an X-Men in particular character, it's like, oh shoot, we keep getting down to the nitty gritty of who some of these characters are. So of course I love seeing Bishop. Of course I love seeing Blink. I love being able to point at the screen like DiCaprio, be like, I know who that is, and keep it going, man. And I think they had a decent amount of time to at least show what their power sets were, and I think I was happy with that. They weren't just, who I'll talk about later on, but they weren't just like Lana Candor's Jubilee, which you don't see anything for, but like they actually did something, and so I was really happy to see him included here.
It's so funny when you look at the cast photo, the promotional image. Literally everybody's wearing black except Blink and Bishop. They're the only ones with any pops of colors, like you just mentioned. It's such a stark contrast, but it's welcome because it's like, damn, can we do more of this? Like, I know we're in the future. I know things are dystopian. I know things are very dire right now, but like, we just don't like color no more. We not rocking with anything but blacks and grays.
Trying to hide, I guess.
I guess it's camouflage, I suppose. To sort of blend in, but fuck all of that. Like, I'm gonna still get some drip off. Like, why not? At that point. But yeah, it was, and again, I think it's also like different powers that we just hadn't seen before, and also Bishop in this story, what he could have been, the importance that he could have played in terms of time travel. We talked about who could have been the substitute possibly for Wolverine. I know they considered Bishop at one point. Bishop has played this role quite often, being one of the time travelers. They also considered Cable. They didn't include him in this movie, but this is also like smart thinking. Like, oh yeah, these are time travelers typically in other mediums, other adaptations of this story. Right. Was there a way to possibly make them, even more important? So I love the stuff that they did here, and I even like all the people that they cast. Like Omar Sy's Bishop is actually kind of
fire.
It's kind of brilliant. It's like really, really good. But again, it's just like yeah, right, yeah, exactly. What was Idris doing at this? Oh, I guess he was in Thor, so he's probably a little too busy. Yeah,
but I could do it.
I do just wonder, like, damn, could we have taken this further? Like, we introduced them here, like you want to just see it go further, which we didn't see, because this movie resets the timeline and it leaves some things a little unclear because they are in the future technically. So I guess they technically couldn't go back to the past and apocalypse, but I mean, you just wonder, like, what could it have been, because these characters are so rich with so many things. We should talk about the returning legacy cast, who came back after, at this point, it was 8 years of being away. We hadn't seen many of them since X-Men The Last Stand. So in some respects, this is kind of a legacy sequel, which has become the norm in Hollywood. But obviously Hugh Jackman, as we noted, came back. But in addition to that, the legends themselves, Ian McKellen and Patrick Stewart, returned. We did see them in the post-credit scene in the Wolverine, like we talked about last week. You also had Shawn Ashmore come back as Iceman. Anna Paquin, we'll get to her in a second about Rogue and her inclusion and ultimate removal from this film. But you did get also Elliot Page, who came back as Kitty Pryde, who did appear briefly kind of in the third movie, but ultimately played a part in this film as well. And of course, Halle Berry as Storm. And then by the end of the movie, we see Famke Jensen comes back as Jean Grey. James Marsden comes back as Cyclops. Kelsey Grammer as Beast. Like, everybody came back by the end of this movie. What did that mean to you, just seeing all of these characters back? I mean, this was, again, kind of the first time that we had something like this, Infinity War
Yeah.
and Endgame had not happened yet. And it's kind of crazy to think about, like, damn, this movie was huge, but could it have been even bigger than what it was? Because this was like important. Because I think a lot of us assume we might not have ever seen those characters again, but they somehow figured out a way to bring them all back into the story.
Yeah, bruh. It had been 10 years, you know what I'm saying, since the first X-Men movie had come out. And I just think about how many times each of us who were sitting in that theater watching Days of Future Past had seen those movies up until that point, and what that meant to us and who all these characters meant to us, man. And so it was, first of all, was crazy seeing them, because I didn't expect it. I didn't know this was the movie I thought it was going to be. I didn't know we would see those characters by the end of the film. I was like, wait a second. I was like holding on to the seat. Like, what is happening here, man? I really loved seeing it. It like, it just had, you get like the feels when you see it, right? It's that tingly feeling in your heart. Like, this is, and it felt like the send off. Even like you said, we didn't get Endgame yet. We didn't get Logan yet. You know what I'm saying? We didn't get any of that stuff. It felt like a real proper send off for what might be the end of these X-Men movies at the time. I was like, oh shoot, if this is where they want to end it, bet. You know what I'm saying? Like, they tied it together, wrapped it in a bow, gave you every character possible. We can leave it here if y'all really want to and do something else later down the line. But I remember just being very happy about that at the time. It made me feel really good about what had transpired in the movie, and it made you just recall all of that X-Men movie history, man. So yeah, it was very welcome, and I really will never forget like that moment when you first see everybody come back at the end of the film. Especially he looks at Jean. I looked at Jean the way Wolverine looked at Jean. I said, Jean, is that you? So yeah, man, it was a really good time.
What's the Homelander meme? It was perfect down to the last minute detail, and just
Yeah.
a smile of just pure joy, because it felt so good, man. It felt so good to reach the end of the story and to know that everybody was back, and ultimately everybody, survived the events because the timeline had been reset. But it was just super effective, because X-Men: The Last Stand was a disappointment, right? That was
Yeah.
not a satisfying end to that trilogy. If it was, we probably wouldn't even be exploring this territory, because everybody would have
Exactly.
been, I think, a lot more hesitant to say, like, oh, well, we don't want to come back because we kind of did that perfectly. But I think everybody involved knew, like, yeah, there's probably something else better we can do here, and they did it, and they
Hmm.
pulled it off, and it was amazing to see everybody, and everybody looked great too. It was just like,
They
it just
did.
puts you in all the feels, and knowing that conclusions for superhero movies was not a typical thing. As we talked about this again last week with Logan. Up until this point, the only sort of concluding superhero live action story that we had really seen was The Dark Knight Rises. That was really
Hmm.
kind of the only example at this point. Like, Tobey Maguire didn't really get a proper send off. They
Nope.
had to pivot and go to Andrew Garfield. Michael Keaton in the '90s didn't get a send off. Like, Christopher
Nope.
Reeve didn't get a send off. Like, there was a lot of stuff that was just always left unfinished. But now we were at a place where it's like, damn, if this is the end, if this is it, like, they did it. I'm totally here for it. Let's talk a little bit more about the story elements. So Bryan Singer was ultimately announced as the film's director. We litigated a lot of his controversial shit in the first episode. I won't retread that territory. If you want to hear about everything that was going on with him, there's plenty to dive into. We talked a lot about that in the original trilogy episode a few weeks ago, but he was still hired as the director here. He was embroiled in some controversy at this point, but ultimately, in preparation for the film, he had a conversation with James Cameron to discuss time travel and string theory and multiverses. I mean, who better to talk to than James Cameron, who had been
Right.
doing a lot of sci-fi work and Terminator stuff, for so long. Did you know, and did you realize that this is technically the first time in a live action superhero movie that we've dealt with multiple realities and multiverses? Like, we hadn't technically done that before, and now it's the only thing we fucking
That's all
deal
we
with.
have.
It's all we have now. It's the only source of storytelling in these new films and TV shows. But just 10 years ago, we had not really explored multiverses and multiple realities. I mean, what? I guess I just want to know, like, how does that make sense in the context of just like how things have progressed? I mean, did this really kind of open the door, for a lot of these other
Mm.
studios and filmmakers to say, like, oh, that's interesting. Like, we can change things. Like, it doesn't have to be permanent. If we made a mistake, we can just like go back and undo it. Like, I guess it sort of created a new trend, for filmmakers to say, like, well, there's always another shot and another chance to make things right if things did not go right the first time.
Yeah, it's so interesting because it's like it was a concept that was becoming more apparent at this time in general. It wasn't just movies. This is like also around the time where like weird example, but like let's say like Ye was coming out with albums and like changing the song. You know what I'm saying? Like changing like different iterations of the album, like as it was sitting on streaming. You know what I'm saying? It's
Yeah.
almost it's so interesting to see like this really, like you said, might be the first time. And I don't know if like it might have been people we were too afraid to try it because that there is energy and money that goes into trying like, all right, let's put a band-aid on this thing, or like let's try to retcon this thing, or like let's try to fix this thing. But it makes sense kind of that like we had never been at a place to really even try that. And so man, I didn't know that until you just said that. Like this is really a thing for me. It's like, whoa, shoot. Days of Future Past really might have opened the can of worms that created all of this. Is Days of Future, but did it lead to all the DC TV stuff on the CW? You know what I'm saying? Did it lead to shoot Spider-Man and Spider-Verse? And I don't know, but it's crazy that to think that this might have been that the first iteration of that, man. So yeah, maybe Apocalypse or not Apocalypse, but maybe Days of Future Past had to kick open the door for everybody in order for everybody to say, yeah, this thing is possible, guys. We're good. Everybody come in. And I wonder if it would have been different if this movie wasn't good. You know what I mean? If the movie wasn't good, would everybody been like, all right, still not possible. We can't do it. And what that would have looked like. I'm very interested.
Oh yeah, for sure. If it didn't work, then nobody's touching it because it's like, oh, that's stupid. That didn't work. Clearly, that's just too much. People can't handle it. It's confusing. But
Mhm.
those earlier inspirations that Matthew Vaughn and Bryan Singer were tapping into, Back to the Future,
Yep.
Terminator, Terminator 2 Judgment Day, those are classic fucking movies. Those are great
Yeah.
films. And time travel as a plot device in a movie, if done well, can be so rewarding and so special and so meaningful because you're
Hmm.
doing something, I think, for the audience in terms of reestablishing nostalgic feelings and moments with things that we're familiar with that we've already seen, but then you're also opening up possibility for the future. You're creating an endless canvas of what you can play with in the future. Like if you pull
Hmm.
it off, that I mean, it's probably the best possible result of a big science fiction movie that you can have. And when it
Yeah.
does work, in the case of A Days of Future Past or an Avengers Endgame, now we're talking about like these are some of the best movies that we've seen in this genre. Like this is some of the best stories because you are allowing yourself to have that ability to go back and maybe
Hmm.
retcon some things. And I'm glad you said that word because you know what genre always retcon shit decades even before this? Horror. Horror fucking retcons everything all the
It
fucking time.
does.
Like they're
It
never
does.
afraid to just say that shit didn't happen. Ignore that. Like they've
What are
been
y'all
doing
talking
that
about?
since the 70s and the 80s. You know, they were
Yep.
always
You're right.
rebooting and resetting things. And so it's interesting that it took, I think, this long for superhero films to finally say like, oh, I guess we have permission to do this, but it had to be based in the comics, right? It had to come from that source
Hmm.
material, and I think that that's a big piece of it. And we were seeing other, sort of multiverse stories pop up at this time. I think the Spider Verse stuff in the comics was really starting to
Hmm.
sort of boil up around this time too. So it definitely kicked the door open and allowed for just all sorts of new possibilities. But also in this movie, the Sentinels, they're a big piece of this story as well, which another huge sort of adversary to the X-Men we had not seen in live action. In the design of this movie, they had two separate versions that they wanted to play with to depict how the earlier prototypes built by Bolivar Trask in the 1970s ultimately evolved into these adaptable killing machines in the dystopian future. Bryan Singer described the 1973 version as a little fun and stylish, but also a little retro, with key element being that they are made of plastic to be unaffected by Magneto's powers. But on the other hand, the future Sentinels would resemble, quote, giant versions of Mystique, end quote, to show how their technological development was based on studying the shape shifting mutants' DNA. Thus, their design is sleek and feminine, with the body covered in mechanical scales that move during the process of adapting to a mutant's attack, while also featuring angular and dark faces to enhance the intimidation. I remember watching this movie, and you sort of alluded to it earlier. That opening scene, wow. I mean, they were just like out the gate. It's like, oh yeah, these Sentinels don't fucking play.
They do not.
What do you want to say just about the Sentinels' presence in this movie? They really are
Yeah.
kind of the arms force, the muscle to combat the X-Men, and they have all sorts of capabilities. And we do get these two separate versions of them: the earlier sort of retro versions, the prototypes, but then ultimately what they evolve to by the time we get to the future timeline. I mean, they're pretty much indestructible by that point in the film.
I love the science and ideology behind using Mystique's DNA to make these Sentinels. It makes so much sense to me. Like when I seen it, I was like, what? Has it been done before? Like, is there a hole in my X-Men knowledge? Like, has this happened before? Because it, of course, the mutant able to shapeshift, you combine that with her being able to shapeshift abilities and adapt, makes a ton of sense. Also, I was like, why don't they also use Darwin? You know what I'm saying? They killed him, like,
Yeah,
unfortunately, but like they could have used Darwin too. But man, I really loved that idea. And what's also weird is I still don't love the look because they don't give us purple sentinels in the future. They give us like these very cold robot, and it does make them more scary. Don't get me wrong. I still do like the look. Don't get me wrong. I just wish they did throw in the sentinel purple.
yeah,
Because it made them feel like a little less iconic than they should. You know what I'm saying? It was like, oh, there's another one of those moments. It's like, oh, we can't touch what they look like in the comics or the animated series. I'm like, yes, y'all can. Like, y'all can change the design a little bit, but throw that purple in there because the classic '70s ones, they had a little purple in it. You know what I'm saying? They at least had a little purple in it. So I was like, I thought that was interesting. But yeah, I really love the idea of what they had here, and they actually posed a real threat, especially in the future. I was like, oh man, these things are scary. I wish the older versions, I wish we did get a better chance to see what those would have looked like. I think just out in the field,
yeah.
because really Magneto just kind of takes them over, and it's like, oh, what Sentinels? But like, I wish we would have been able to see like some mutants get hunted in the '70s with those Sentinels. I really wish we got that moment. But I think overall, man, I really like the Sentinels in here. I think they made sense. I love the threat they pose. Yeah, I hope we get some more Sentinels. The MCU got to bring these Sentinels out, dog. They have to. Like
Oh,
whenever it's mutant saga
1000%.
time,
Yeah.
I need these Sentinels to go crazy because we just seen some good ones in X-Men '97. But man, yeah, I'm pretty excited to see what they're going to continue to do. But I think this movie had really good ideas when it came to their design.
Yeah, this was such a treat. I was like, okay, yeah, now we're starting to dive deep. We're starting to tap in and get to that stuff that, again, not necessarily, taking it away from the grounded approach that, that sort of brought them to the dance, but let's get a little bit more fun with this. Like, let's lean into the more just like crazy elements of X-Men. Like Sentinels is a wild fucking concept. Like,
It
and
is.
and as you said, the way that they integrated into the story and how they created them, it's like, oh, that's brilliant. Y'all did a great job at doing that. And they pose a true credible threat. Like, we're talking about soulless killing machines. That's the Terminator side of things. That's the Skynet stuff, that
Hell
I'm
yeah.
sure James Cameron was probably like, well, what do you guys have that like you can use? Like, is there a machine? Is there some sort of like program? And they were like, oh, in fact, we do. We absolutely do. Sentinels, bring them into the movie. Like, this makes all the sense in the world for time travel, for multiple
Yeah.
generations, because you can continue to evolve them and develop them. Like, it's literally T2, T1000, everything. It's like, it's brilliant. It just works so well, and I love their presence here. I agree. I wanted to see more of those older versions, but it was great, and it was a really, really good start. And hopefully with the MCU, man, they just go all the way with it. Because also at the same time, what's great about the Sentinels, because they're not human, they're not real. The X-Men, they can just go fucking crazy on them when they're using their powers. Like, we can see all sorts of stuff. Like, just like we saw in X-Men '97, they can just go as crazy and as wild as they want to. They don't have to worry about killing somebody. These are robots. Like, do whatever the fuck you want. So yeah, love them in pretty much, sort of what they brought to the movie. Mystique, very, very important to this movie. And in the first movie, in First Class, they established this familial relationship with Mystique and Charles. They very much grew up in the same household, so they make her character connected to him in a meaningful way. But they're also starting to play with her adversarial side, her darker side. I mean, historically, Mystique is more of a villain, and sometimes anti-hero, but more of a villainous figure in the comics. And here they're certainly leaning into that. I mean, she's the central sort of piece of this story, because her act of violence, her determination to kill Bolivar Trask, that creates this anti-mutant hysteria that allows the creation of the Sentinels. And so she becomes very, very essential to the movie. It's no coincidence that Jennifer Lawrence has a lot more screen time and a lot more to do in this movie compared to First Class, because in the interim, she became a superstar. She was leading the Hunger Games franchise. She won an Academy Award for Silver Linings Playbook. So by
Yeah.
the time they got to Days of Future Past, they were like, yeah, we got to write her up. This is like a leading woman in the making. And she had acquired so much success at a young age. I mean, she was like 24 when this movie came out. It's kind of like Jennifer
Mhm.
Lawrence is only 33 right now. She's like a year
Yep.
older than me. I just can't even, that doesn't even make sense to
Yep.
me, you know, and it feels like she's been with us for so long. But anything you want to say about Mystique and just like how she's utilized in this movie? And in addition to that, I think the fact that throughout this entire series, as we continue to progress on, eventually, they lean more into the idea of her being a hero as opposed to a villain.
For
You know,
sure.
that's
Yep.
something that they don't shy away from. What do you want to say about that? Her obviously, again, her place in this movie, but also just like her presence throughout this entire series of films and how they sort of changed up her motivation and who she was as a character as compared to the comics.
Yeah, man. First thing I want to call I think it's hilarious if you go from First Class to Days of Future Past, she gets hella blue. Like she goes from like blue in First Class to like hella blue in Days of Future Past, man. I was like, because I think I literally watched them back to back, and I was like, wait a second, they oversaturated you in this movie. It's crazy
That
how
blue
blue you
budget
are.
went crazy. The blue dye. Oh man, what did they use?
it it went nuts. What's funny is in I think it was Dark Phoenix, it's dialed back. It's actually not as blue anymore.
Yep.
Literally her blueness was like a roller coaster. I was like, y'all need to make up y'all mind on how blue this girl is gonna be, man. But Jennifer Lawrence, a star. Just she was a star and is a star, man. And I think one thing I was worried about in watching First Class that we loved so much about the X-Men, the original X-Men trilogy, was I think the physicality of Raven and Mystique and what she was doing in those films. Like I remember us talking about, like she had some of the coolest really action moments in that original trilogy. And in First Class, it was like, we didn't get too much of that. But Days of Future Past, it was like, oh no, she's back. It was like, nope, she's gonna be whooping ass. She's gonna be giving us a lot of that espionage we're talking about. She's in Trask's office. And I loved seeing her kind of as both the beacon of hope and the beacon of what all could be lost. It was so cool to me that she was literally the hero and the villain at the same time in this story. I think that's really they framed her really well in that way, because that's a very, I think, hard thing to pull off. But given the story, given all the mutants were like, she's literally freeing mutants. Wow, again, Wolverine knows if she continues on this path, all could be lost. So, man, I thought she was a really good vehicle for this movie and everything that she had to do, man. But I think Jennifer Lawrence did a fine job. I didn't have too many qualms with her, to be honest. She was just, yeah, she was fine. In the first movie, in First Class, she was literally just trying to have sex with Magneto goddamn whole time. I was like, all right, that's enough of that. But then she had a lot more to do in this movie, like you said, and I think it all made sense for what was going on, man. And so yeah, I like her. I liked her in this movie a lot, man. I think she did a good job.
I think these first two films, First Class, Days of Future Past, the way that she's utilized makes a ton of sense, and also her becoming this mutant liberator in the story it's pretty spot on, and I think it makes all the sense in the world, especially in relation to her, sort of development and relationship with both Charles and Eric and how that progressed and evolved over time. I do just wonder, again, thinking about how these films played out, like, was it the right decision to keep her heroic?
Mm-hmm.
She's always been conflicted, of course, and there's shades to her, no pun intended. There's many things you can do with her and just her morality at play, but I don't know. I felt like I wanted to see a proper villain out of Mystique.
Yeah.
Like, be conflicted in this movie, because it does go back and forth in Days of Future Past, and I think that's great. But use that as the impetus, as the foundation for her to go down a darker path. And they didn't really go that way. They instead said, "No, she's just a hero. We got to have her as a
Raven
hero."
Everdeen.
You're right. Yeah.
Mystique Everdeen. Is that what they wanted her to
Pretty
be?
much. It almost felt like more of a business decision. They just didn't want to make Jennifer Lawrence an antagonist. They wanted her to be a leading woman in the series, have a strong female character. I get that, but she was a superstar, and I just think that kind of was at odds with Mystique as a character in the comics, and that doesn't really add up and create this consistent flow and feel of who we know her to be in those stories versus who she's portrayed to be in these particular movies. Not a huge gripe, but whenever we do get back to Mystique, I think that this is something like, okay, let's let's kind of go back to the to what we know her to be. Let's go back to those
Mm-hmm.
foundational pieces of her character. Um, from a visual effects perspective, there's something interesting here I want to talk about. We kind of briefly touched on it, but there's a pretty groundbreaking action sequence in the middle of this movie from Quicksilver, who we talked about earlier. This movie ultimately had about 1,300 visual effects shots, which is low compared to what we hear about these days. I mean,
Yep.
you look at some MCU movies, they're talking about 24, 25, 26, 2,700 shots visual effects. It's kind of crazy. But Rising Sun Pictures is the visual effects house that created the sequence for Quicksilver, which basically depicted him as a speedster, and his actions happening in real time while everything around him is drastically slowed down. They did so much research and so many quirky things to pull this off. They did a scan of the kitchen set, digital recreation to add some of the computer generated props and cooking gear and cutlery, but to simulate him running on the walls. Evan Peters, obviously the actor who portrays Quicksilver, and a stunt double, they were filmed in both the sets being suspended by a harness and on a treadmill that stood in front of a chroma key green screen. So they did some real trickery there, and only Evan Peters' legs were ultimately digitally replaced. And despite the sequence only having 29 effect shots, crazy 29 effect shots, it required nearly 7 months of work from Rising Sun Pictures
Wow.
team of 70 artists. And it looks that way. I mean, this is
Mm-hmm.
a show stopping scene in the movie. I mean, what do you remember
Yeah.
about the first time witnessing this on the big screen when you saw it?
I was like, oh, this is a movie because again, we have been through I think enough steps at this moment to be like, oh, y'all are really kicking it out here. Like as filmmakers and as people watching X-Men and loving X-Men and making X-Men movies, this is like, oh no, y'all are serious. Like this is just one of those moments that makes you think, that makes you love filmmaking, to be honest. Because how the hell did y'all get this done? That's what I remember. I think about the time, like how the hell did they do that? Like there was it wasn't a small room; it was a big ass kitchen that they were doing this in. And I remember just being like, "Wow, can we rewind? Like, can we watch that again? Like, I wanted to go back and watch it in slow motion again, like even slower, maybe, like because that was actually nuts." And I really like. I think the Evan Peters also nails this scene so well, just in his temperament. The way he moved was just perfect. The way his facial expressions, even the way he moved bullets to the side and pans to the side and things. I was just like, no, this dude is killing it as well. So yeah, bro, it's one of those scenes I think that makes you love the process of filmmaking, and I think the attention to detail, which is even more important, because they easily could have done one of those scenes where he just moves really fast and then that's it. It could have been a 3-second scene if they really wanted it to be. They could have saved money and did all that, but they didn't. They wanted to be deliberate and they wanted it to be a really cool, fun set piece. So yeah, I loved every bit of it, bro. It's to me like it's the best part of the movie. They absolutely killed it.
It's incredible stuff. And Rising Sun Pictures, I mean, phenomenal work on the visual effects. I remember seeing this with friends, when this came out, and I remember the first thing I said in the movie after that scene was done. I looked at them, I'm like, the fuck is Marvel Studios gonna do? What the MCU's gonna do? Quicksilver's coming in Avengers next year. I mean, are they going to be able to top that? And no, they couldn't. And
No. No.
it's too good. It's just too inventive. It's too creative. Um, it also, to be fair, set up a bad trend for speedsters in live action because everything became about slowing shit down as opposed to seeing the actual speed of the speedster. And that's been a consistent criticism. Like, okay, well, Flash comes out and everything gets slowed down in slow motion. They obviously revisit what Evan Peters does in Apocalypse. I mean, other speed, like that just became the norm. Like that's how we showcase speed, where it's like, all
Mm-hmm.
right, well, now I actually just want to see them run fast. And how can we make that look good? So it did set up, I think, somewhat of a reverse desired effect in some ways. Like it was cool for this, but then all of a sudden, showcasing speedsters all of a sudden became about actually slowing things down instead of actually showing the speed, at least in live action, of course. But moving on, there's something else to talk about here with just ultimately the placement of this movie. I think in this entire franchise, Matthew Vaughn did not direct this movie. He stepped away, and he revealed years later the reason he stepped away. He said that originally he envisioned that Days of Future Past was going to be the third installment in a trilogy, but the studio decided otherwise. And he spoke to comingsoon.net. He had a quote. It's pretty long, but bear with me. He said, quote, "That's one of the reasons I didn't continue, because they didn't listen to me. My plan was First Class, then the second film was New Young Wolverine in the 70s to continue those characters, my versions of the X-Men. So you really get to know all of them. And my finale was going to be Days of Future Past. That was going to be my number 3, where you bring them all, because what's bigger than bringing in Ian McKellen and Michael and Stuart and James and bringing them all together? When I finished the Days of Future Past script with it ready to go, I looked at it and said, I really think it would be fun to cast Tom Hardy or someone as the young Wolverine and then bring it all together at the end. Fox read Days of Future Past and went, oh, this is too good. We're doing it now, end quote. So Fox said, fuck that. We're not waiting. We're doing this movie immediately. Do you think that this should have waited? Should this movie have come out later? Should we have had another movie with that younger cast, with Patrick, or not Patrick Stewart, but with James McAvoy and Michael Fassbender? Should we have had a little bit more time to really build up the relationship with them and then bring it all together as like the concluding act of a trilogy, or does it even matter? Well, was this sort of the perfect time to try to pull off this experiment?
Wow. What a question, because I really don't know. It's hard because I'm just I don't know what those other movies look like, and I think that's what makes it hard. But also the timing of it all was also hard to talk about because the Days of Future Past was so successful. So it's hard for me to be like, we should have waited, because it's like, should we have? I don't know. The proof is kind of in the pudding a little bit about how the movie turned out, but also in terms of storytelling and what could have been done in those in-between times, who knows, man? We could have got some really cool stories with that younger cast, with seeing James McAvoy and Michael Fassbender some more. But we get a lot of them in these two movies as well. Like, it's not like we don't see them in their relationship isn't built successfully in First Class and successfully in this film as well. So it's weird. I don't know, man. It's weird. I'm gonna let you answer. I have no idea.
I think we should have waited for sure. I mean, look at what we got after this. That tells you exactly what you need to know.
Oh, they just shouldn't have done them at all.
Exactly. This should have been the last concluding story.
Oh, yeah.
If it was going to be a true trilogy, do another movie with the younger cast, with McAvoy, Fassbender, Jennifer Lawrence, all of them. Bring them back, of course.
Oh, yeah.
A young Wolverine, in addition to Hugh Jackman.
Fire.
That could have been really fire. So we would have only had one movie with him, but that sounds like you cast it right. That could be really cool. And if Days of Future Past was truly a conclusion, if it really rounded out this entire story, we're having different conversations about all of this, if you ask me. But Fox, some of the other producers, they didn't want to go that way. They saw this as more of a launching pad for what can come next. And that's not bad thinking. I'm not saying that that's terrible, because there's obviously so many more X-Men things you can do. But again, just knowing what we got after it is like those other two movies, not really worth it if we could have ended it off with Days of Future Past, if you ask me.
No, you're right. Because I actually had a thought. It was like, what if Days of Future Past really was just a longer movie? Like, I know we be talking about part ones and part twos really often, but this is a story. If you put 2 parts on this thing, it makes
a lot of sense. Yeah.
It makes total sense. It's long in the comics. It's long. Shoot, the TV had to do a couple episodes. You know what I'm saying? Like, it really is one of those stories. So I in my mind, First Class, Days of Future Past 1, Days of Future Past 2, I would have been okay with that as well.
It could have worked. Even with that idea, perhaps there's somewhere in that two-parter where we could have gotten more time with the characters we talked about earlier, like Bishop and Blink and Sunspot. Like,
shit, throw Cable in there if you got to.
That's what I'm saying. Like, now you really open it up to like, okay, we can really spend time in the future and see like how the fuck things got here, because we don't get any of that. Like, they don't. All the in-between stuff between the 70s and what year is it, like 2029 or something in this movie? Like, we don't see anything like how it just regressed so quickly. You know, I mean, that's not a lot of time for things to end up the way that they look in this movie. It looks like terrible where they're at. So I think that there definitely could have been more there. So a two-parter might not have been a bad idea. Did you see The Amazing Spider-Man 2 in theaters when it came out?
I did.
Do you remember the mid-credit scene for The Amazing Spider-Man 2 being a scene from Days of Future Past? It was the Mystique.
What?
It was the Mystique scene. When she was at Vietnam, it was the scene where she infiltrated the the military camp. That was the
Oh
mid-credit scene
yeah.
on The Amazing Spider-Man 2. I don't know if you remember that or not.
I do actually. I remember being like, "What? Wait a second. What's happening here? What the hell?" I do.
Strange as fuck, right? Yeah,
It
absolutely
was so
strange.
weird. I do remember that now. Wow.
Two different studios. We're talking about Sony with Spider-Man and Fox with X-Men. This was weird. I remember watching the Amazing Spider-Man 2, Days of Future Past, had not come out yet. Amazing Spider-Man 2, the movie ends, not that great. And then mid-credit scene, I'm thinking like, oh, they're gonna set up something else. It's a scene for Days of Future Past, which hadn't come out yet. Went with a bunch of friends again. You know, we were in college, and I remember looking at everybody like, what the fuck? What is this? Like, are they trying to tie these things in, not knowing the context?
Mhm.
But apparently this happened because the Amazing Spider-Man 2 director Mark Webb had an existing contract with Fox Searchlight Pictures because he was going to direct another film after 500 Days of Summer, which came out in 2009. But he ended
That's
up
a good
getting the
movie.
gig to direct The Amazing Spider-Man, and ultimately his negotiations with Sony Pictures stalled because of his commitment to Fox. And Fox eventually agreed to allow him to direct The Amazing Spider-Man 2, and in exchange, Sony promoted the X-Men film without charge. They had to include that scene in the post-credits of The Amazing Spider-Man 2 for fucking free. So, again, this just goes back to our Quicksilver conversation earlier. Marvel Studios
Hmm.
sharing rights. Now they're having to include scenes in a movie that they're not even fucking like a part of at all. Sony has to. I mean, what do you just briefly like? What do you recall? I mean, it was kind of chaos at this point. Like everything was all over the place. Like the rights, like we had three different studios making Marvel movies now. This was kind of the last time that would happen because shortly after the Amazing Spider-Man 2, we know Sony would share the rights with Marvel
Hmm.
Studios, and so we're starting to reduce things down now to where it's just it's the MCU and Disney. But at this point, things are just in all sorts of different directions. So I mean, what were your thoughts on just seeing this and then ultimately knowing that there's just so much shit that goes behind the scenes that really influences how these things turn out?
Bro, I really forgot about this. You like activated a crazy memory in my head because I remember. I think I was with friends seeing Amazing Spider-Man 2, and we were all like, what the hell is this? What's going on? I never knew any of this until just now, unless the actual what went down and why it was like this, and because I legit just kind of forgot about it. I was like, well, maybe something weird was going on. But yeah, it was getting messy at this time. Like you said, three different studios making Marvel movies. The rights are all over the place. What's even funnier is like the fact that Amazing Spider-Man 2 is such a bonkers movie already. Like, so we get to the mid credit scene and you're just like, huh?
Dude,
What is this? Yeah, there's too much, man. I'm so glad eventually, like we all are under one umbrella now. That's what I'm thinking. It's just like Sony, we have a partnership. Fox, we have Disney has bought. Like we're in a different place than we have ever been. But chaos is the best way I think to explain what was happening at that time because it was just so. It takes you kind of out the post credit scene because you're talking about Spider-Man, and then Mystique is freeing some people in the middle of it. It was crazy, man. Yeah, insane,
it's
insane.
so silly. I mean, think about the note that the Amazing Spider-Man 2 ended on. It ends on the death of Gwen
The
Stacy. The
saddest
saddest
ends.
shit you could possibly do. It was like really effective. Like, oh my god, they're doing that. And then you get
Mm.
this sequence that doesn't even take place not only in the same universe but in an entirely different timeline. Like the 70s in Vietnam. Like what the it was just it was jarring. It was just so jarring. It was so strange and so weird. I hope I never see nothing like that again because that's true studio corporate bullshit. Like I get that he had a contract and he had commitments, but that just it was just such silly stuff, to put that in this movie. The road cut became a big thing. So 20th Century Fox Home
Mhm.
Entertainment ended up releasing an alternate version of the movie The Road Cut. It came out in 2015, so about a full year after the release of the movie in theaters. It added 17 minutes of previously unused footage involving an entire subplot of Anna Paquin's character Rogue, who basically got cut out of the theatrical cut of the movie. When did you see the Road Cut? How do you feel about the road cut in comparison to the theatrical cut? Is it better? Is it worse? Do you wish they kept that stuff with Rogue in? And it's not even just that. There's also like added dialogue. Some scenes are changed.
Mhm.
There's some moments like there's a scene with like Wolverine and Beast that's pretty funny. That's not in the theatrical cut. Where do you fall on that conversation?
Wow. I remember when it first kind of came up. In fact, this is like the early version of the Snyder Cut, low key. You like the road cut? What the hell is the road cut? And like you said, it comes out like a year after, and it's so interesting because it does add something to the movie. It does add a whole nother plot point to the movie, and I do like it. But it's funny because Days of Future Past still works by itself without the road cut too. It's so weird because usually we're like it added to the movie or we didn't need that at all. But this one is like kind of either or for me. It's like if you watch the road cut, cool, it works. I think the scenes make sense. I think Kitty was literally bleeding in the movie.
Yeah.
And you can see the moment where Wolverine sees Stryker, and it's like, wait, is that it? We just kind of come back together, and then he's good again, and Kitty's good again. But when you see the road cut and you see them again go save Rogue, and Bobby has to die for saving Rogue, and it's just like, whoa, there's actually a lot here. And I think it's weird because Anna Paquin was such an important part of those, that original trilogy, and to not see her in the movie at all was like, whoa, what's happening? So it makes sense that there's a road cut out there. So yeah, man, it's one of those where it's like, if you watch it, it works, and if you don't watch it, it also works. I think it's just one of those weird cases for me where it goes both ways like that. But I like it. I think it's cool. I don't really have any problems with it, man.
Yeah, I like it too. It's the version I've seen the least. Like I've actually watched the theatrical cut more than the Rogue cut. But I do like the stuff that they have there with Rogue. I do like the whole, Magneto and Bobby going to save her. They have to go through the mansion. Like all of that stuff is really cool. And I mean, it would have been really effective to have that in the movie in theaters to see like her return and sort of save the day in the middle of it when things are super dire. I wonder if there was like a happy medium, not including every single thing from the Rogue cut in the theatrical cut, but at least including that Rogue subplot. Because again, they do add in other scenes and other things are altered, but ultimately, it's strange that it does kind of work both ways. I mean, I think it's not really a situation where like this is absolutely superior and this is inferior. Like it's not, but it's also telling because they filmed the sequence, like everything that happens in the theatrical cut makes sense because they film it that way. And everything in the road cuts makes, like, you don't actively miss footage from the theatrical cut. So they already knew going into this, like, we're filming two versions of this, right? Like, they had to sort of plan for that. And that's not, like, strange, but I think it's telling that they were already tinkering with the idea, like, well, let's do a version where it's Kitty the entire time, and let's do a version where we bring back Rogue, and if we can figure it out, then we can include it. But ultimately, that didn't affect the success of this movie. Super successful. It made $747.9 million at the global box office. It was the highest grossing film during its opening weekend, earned $90.8 million, made it the second highest opening weekend of the series at the time behind The Last Stand, which opened to $102.7 million, but it is currently the highest grossing X-Men movie. It's not the highest grossing Fox Marvel movie. That distinction goes to the Deadpool 1 and Deadpool 2, but in terms of X-Men films, this is the highest grossing one. 90% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes, 75 average score on Metacritic out of 100, and an A cinema score from audiences. And so everybody loved it. This was like unanimously sort of agreed upon that this was like the definitive X-Men film up until this point. And it was one of the top 10 highest grossing films of that year. It was number 6 at the global box office. There's other superhero movies in 2014, The Winter Soldier, Guardians of the Galaxy. I mean, it was a pretty packed year. How do you sort of, look back on this year, and where does Days of Future Past compare to those other films? Because a lot of people would say 2014 is one of, if not the greatest year for live action comic book movies that we've gotten so far.
It's the year we refer to, bro. They were cooking with grease, dog. Guardians, Winter Soldier. Come on, man. Even outside of that, bro. Dawn of the Planet of the Apes. What are we talking about? We're killing it. A Hunger Games movie comes out. What else is on here? Interstellar comes out. It's just like the movies in general was popping. Like everybody is just cooking. I don't know what was going on in that year in 2013 when everybody's actually making these films. Everybody clearly was inspired, you know what I'm saying? And everybody was coming with the heat, man. And I think, that year really did set a ton of precedent for what's to happen. But I'm really proud of, X-Men for being able to reach that number. I think part of it was like the superhero golden age. So everybody was like, shit, X-Men coming out, let's go see that too. Guardians coming out, shit, let's go see it. Like everybody was just ready for anything because everything was really working for the most part. Even Amazing Spider-Man 2, not the greatest movie ever, but made a ton of money. People was ready to go into the movies, man. Like they was really killing it at this time. So yeah, man, I think it's definitely the movie or the year we're going to continue to compare it to, because you've heard me say, bro, next year has the opportunity to supersede 2014. It has the opportunity. We don't know if it's going to hit it, but it has the opportunity to do so. But 2014 is going to be the year that we will be referring to.
Yeah, 2014 is really, really special. I do think 2018 is the single best year that we've gotten so far, but 2014 is right behind it. This was a special time. I was graduating college. There
Yeah.
was so much happening in 2014. It was a overall just a packed year in life, in just real life, and then like we were getting really, really incredible stuff, as you said, just across the board. It's regarded as one of the better movie years of the 21st century for sure, and even with big budget IP, that we've sort of talked about here that overperforms. It was really phenomenal stuff that was coming out, especially on the part of Marvel and what they were doing across the board with the MCU. It was just a great time.